Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the first track of this year's VMI conference. My name is Amy Owens, and I'm the DEQ Valley Regional Director out of our Harrisonburg office. What we're going to do today is give you the latest and greatest DEQ updates in our various media. We have a very distinguished panel of our director, Mr. Paler, and our four division directors. What I'm going to do, well, first of all, I'm not going to stand behind the podium because I'm only 4 feet tall. But what we are going to do is I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I will introduce David, who has some remarks, and he will be showing our 25th anniversary video, which will give you a sense of where a DEQ has been and where it's going. And then the four panelists will speak. And then we will take questions thereafter. And I will wander through with the microphone so everybody can hear everyone's questions. So are we ready? All right, thank you. Our first speaker is Melanie, or actually our second speaker, is our Water Permitting Division Director, Melanie Davenport. Melanie became the director of the Water Division in May of 2011. In 2015, the division was split between permitting and planning. As the Director of Water Permitting, Melanie is responsible for stormwater, VPDES permitting, biosolids, wetlands, and compliance. Melanie has held a number of positions at DEQ, including Director of Enforcement, Assistant Air Division Director, and as a Special Assistant to the Secretary of Natural Resources. Melanie also worked for the Virginia Legislature, serving 3 years as the Virginia Director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Prior to returning to DEQ, she spent 10 years practicing environmental law at Troutman Sanders. Melanie received her BA from Boston University in marine biology and her law degree from William & Mary. Our next panelist will be Jutta Schneider. Jutta has been the director of DEQ's Water Planning Division since 2015. The Water Planning Division is responsible for water quality standards, monitoring and assessment, total maximum daily load and non-point source management programs, water supply planning, water withdrawal permitting, and compliance, as well as Chesapeake Bay-related programs. Jutta began her public service with the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1998, working as an analyst at the Department of Conservation and Recreation. From 1999 to 2007, she served at DCR and then at the Department of Environmental Quality as a program manager and program coordinator for the Total Maximum Daily Load program. She also worked 8 years in DEQ's Land Protection and Revitalization Division, serving in several coordinator and management roles. Jutta is a graduate of the, and this is the anglicized version because the real German name of this university, you could wrap around this building twice. A graduate of the University of Freiburg. Close enough? Okay. Next is Mike Dowd. Mike is the director of the Air and Renewable Energy Division for DEQ. Mike oversees air quality planning, permitting, compliance, monitoring, and mobile source programs, as well as the Small Renewable Energy Permit by Rule program. Prior to becoming air director, Mr. Dowd served also as DEQ's enforcement director. Before joining DEQ, Mike was an attorney in private practice with law firms in Richmond, Washington, D.C., and Columbus, Ohio. Mike graduated from Columbia University and has a JD from Vermont Law School. He is the treasurer and past chair of the Mid-Atlantic Regional Air Management Association, otherwise known as MARAMA. He's a former board member and co-chair of the Enforcement Committee of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, NACA, and it goes on. And he is currently a member of the Executive Committee of the National Council on Electricity Policy and a member of the Harvard Electricity Policy Group. And lastly, we have Justin Williams. Justin is the Division Director for the Land Protection and Revitalization Division at DEQ, where he oversees the solid and hazardous waste programs, remediation programs, and petroleum storage tank programs. Prior to becoming Division Director in 2015, Justin served as the Office of Waste Permitting and Compliance Director, which oversaw solid and hazardous waste permitting and compliance for DEQ. Justin previously served as Waste Enforcement Manager in DEQ's Division of Enforcement when he joined DEQ in 2008. Justin was, interestingly enough, previously an assistant public defender for the city of Danville and clerked for EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. Justin graduated from East Tennessee State University with a degree in environmental health and received his JD from Appalachian School of Law. He has been appointed to and serves as the chair of the Virginia Waste Management Facility Operators Board and as the chair of the Environmental Law Section of the Richmond Bar Association. And last but not least is David Paler. We were celebrating our 25th anniversary at DEQ yesterday, and we're very, very happy and excited to have the governor join us, where he announced that David has been reappointed director of DEQ. Yes, thank you very much. He was previously appointed by Terry McAuliffe in 2014 and by Bob McDonnell in January of 2010. He was originally appointed director by Tim Kaine in 2006. David's career began in 1973 with the State Water Control Board and has continued with DEQ. He began as a field biologist and held a variety of positions after that as an aquatic ecologist, water resources manager, director of petroleum programs, and director of operations. Dave is president of the Environmental Research Institute of the States. David graduated from Duke University with a bachelor's degree in zoology and received his master's from Oregon State University in fisheries science. He and his lovely wife, Lisa, have 2 children, Kelsey and Grant, and his hobbies include camping, canoeing, and woodworking. And we're very, very happy that you're taking this microphone.
Thank you, Amy. I'll just go with what I've got. Thank you. That was when I had hobbies, or time for hobbies. It's always good to be here. And want to talk a little bit about 25 years of DEQ. Can't believe it's been 25 years. The good news is that it turns out that organizations age faster than people do. Because I can't be 25 years older at this point. But we've come a long way in 25 years. Some people gave me a few interesting notes. In 1993, we were still using public telephones. We were making mixed cassette tapes. We were sending photos off to be developed. We were using telephone books. And when you didn't know a word, you looked it up in the dictionary. Cheers was in its final season, and the World Wide Web was being first made available to the public, and Beanie Babies were first being sold. In 1993, we had 6.5 million people in Virginia, population. Now it's 8.5 million. So that's put a lot more environmental pressure on us as well. So to plan to celebrate our 25th anniversary, what we did was we interviewed a lot of folks and took videos of them. real high-tech videos with the best video equipment we've got. And we've put some different videos together that on different subjects to sort of reminisce on where we've come from and where we are. But before I get to showing you the video, I want to say that some interesting themes came out of those interviews and some surveys that we did and so forth that were very gratifying for me. Some of the agency's strengths that people saw now are systems thinking, changing the paradigm from cleanup to prevention, changing the paradigm from outputs to outcomes, meaning results matter more than activities, using cutting-edge science and technology, leveraging resources. That's something that you learn how to do when there are a lot of budget cuts. Consistency, working as teams to address complex problems, progress in restoration, and partnering to enhance our effectiveness. Those are things that that we can be proud of, and we're real happy for. So before I make a couple other comments and reminisce a little bit more about DEQ, I want to let you see the video from some of our other folks and their thoughts about where we've come with DEQ in the last 25 years. So if you don't mind running that.
Well, it's very interesting. When I started almost 30 years ago at this point, it was very, very commonplace for us to have fish kills every other week, and people would dump on purpose. And they were really very, very cavalier about their environmental stewardship. And that has changed a good bit. People now are very cognizant that environmental protection is about not only this aesthetic good thing, but that it's also very important to keeping their own book of business and their own property and their own concerns and needs and operations clean and viable and profitable. And so you see people who otherwise, they wouldn't have cared one way or the other, and they were very, very irritated that the state was coming and pushing them around. And now it's part of their regular business plan and operations, and they seek to do the right thing, and they consult with state.
That in Northern Virginia, the population of Northern Virginia in those 25 years has increased by more than 1 million people, and accompanying that growth has been an enormous amount of construction of new homes, new roads, commercial properties, schools, an enormous increase in vehicles, and demand for electricity, demand for water supply, the demand for sewage collection and treatment. And what's been most impressive, most noteworthy, is that during that same 25 years, with that growth, we have very real, true, measured improvements in air quality, improvements in water quality, improvements in the way that we manage our vehicles, the way we manage our waste, our petroleum products, and stormwater, and the protection of streams and wetlands. These things are all very real, have improved.
Large numbers of releases, and they were large-scale releases because tanks before then had not been adequately monitored. And so through the years we've seen the severity of releases, I think, decrease.
I think the most interesting improvement really isn't in context of how many gallons or how many pounds or how many nutrients. I think we always measure things in environmental arena. We always measure things in how much we've reduced in the concept of pollution. But to me, really, the thing that's changed the most is probably how we as leaders impacted our environmental community. And so the reductions we've seen in pollution go along with or correlate to our advancements in how we function as an agency. So if we take our historic approach of State Water Control Board land, water, air, those individual boards, we came together and created DEQ. We were able to first create a vision and a mission. We then moved into values and the creation of the 7 C's, strategic planning, and finding ways to move forward to promote sustainability of environmental program and community, not just to implement regulations.
I think when I first started, I think one of the biggest problems with the agency was the way we were confrontational with permittees, with the public. I think the 7 C's that were established weren't just a poster on the wall. I think the agency took a major step in trying to be more consistent how we apply environmental regulations, trying to be more commitment to each other and to the environment, to the citizens as well. I think now we have much more of a culture of working with people to fix environmental problems rather than being in a confrontational relationship with people. I think that's been a very positive thing for the agency to make that shift. I think management has made a real commitment to changing the culture of the agency.
It used to be 20 years ago or so where you got a lot of points and good grades for counting beans. I think as an agency we've been evolving the way we do business from with our more holistic approaches, risk-based strategies, watershed approaches, more innovative thinking, and we are really, through our outcome-oriented thinking, we are examining the why. Why are we doing what we're doing, and then searching for the how.
In the past, when we take a look at a facility, we tend to look at what's going on at the facility kind of with a very narrow focus about what our program interests are. But being co-located and being one agency allows us to work across program lines and look and see how our programs overlap and better coordinate and have a better single response from the agency than individual responses that sometimes might be conflicting and might not result in the best outcome.
We hire the right people, we get the right people in the right jobs, and we get things done efficiently, effectively, and in a way that makes sure that everything is protected.
Well, the staff is the most important part of our agency. Who we are is our staff, and that's the importance of our values too. The staff reflect our values to the world, and they carry out the responsibilities of our meeting our mission. We're nothing without the work that the staff does. It's essentially who we are, and the success that we have as an agency isn't nearly as dependent on the leadership as it is on the work that the staff does every day and the way that they relate to the public.
So 25 years ago, we were 4 separate agencies: air pollution control, water pollution control, Council on the Environment, waste management. We had 4 different ways of doing things. We had folks with a top-down approach to management and some bottom-up approaches to management and maybe some no approaches to management. And and we came together, not sure that maybe sure that we didn't want to be together. And we had to figure out who we were. And that took some time to merge 4 cultures together. Those of you who have been involved in change management know that that those things are a process that you have to go through. And it started to culminate when we begin to ask the question who we are, what are our principles, what are our values, what do we operate by. I heard Jim Collins speak a few years back. One of the points that he impressed upon us was that great organizations are are characterized by lasting, enduring values. And so back in the middle 90s, late 90s, we began to actively try to figure out who we are. And that came with our value systems that we call the 7 C's, because we alliterate things a lot. And customer service was at the start of it. And that was a big battle back in the day, philosophical battle. Do we provide customer service, or are we cops? And we think we're both. And we don't think they're incompatible now. And we think customer service means listening to all sides of an issue, and finding common ground where it exists, and finding the sweet spot in an answer. It means not having a culture of no, but trying to put in the extra effort to get to the hard yes so that we can help things move forward. Collaboration, we believe the best decisions are made as a group, both internally and externally. It's one of the reasons we spend a lot of time with stakeholder groups, especially in regulation development, to hear from all sides of an issue, to make the best possible decision with all the information. We decentralized our way of doing business so it could be more timely and more responsive to the public, and that introduced issues of making sure that our 6 regional offices are doing the same things the same way and are consistent. We prioritize communication internally and externally. We value transparency. We value certainty. The way I like to put that is, we're good to our word. You can take what we tell you, and you could go make plans based on it. We value closure, which means we get things done. We don't leave them languishing. And we're committed to the environment. So those became values that we adopted, around 2000, 99, 2000, something like that. And we have continued to try to work those values and become more and more characterized by those values over the years. So 25 years ago, so that's a little bit about who we try to be as an organization, who we aspire to be as an organization in terms of our value. But 25 years ago, the EPA ozone standard was 120 parts per billion, and we didn't meet it in Richmond and Northern Virginia. Today, the standard is 70 parts per billion, and we meet it everywhere except for Northern Virginia, and we almost meet it there. 25 years ago, we had close to 200 individual databases in Lotus and any other kind of spreadsheet or database that you want to put together that were individually put together. Now we have one database that's integrated, comprehensive environmental data system. And we've actually been able to develop it to the point where it's interactive enough that our employees actually sort of like it. The first iteration of it was like, why the heck do we have to do this? We got one database. We've also got an awful lot of our files electronically now. We have spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of manpower in developing electronic or digitization of our paper files. I don't know how much money that has saved us in square footage rental costs for no file rooms anymore, but it's not insignificant. And it will hopefully lead to more and more faster and faster transparency of documents under the Freedom of Information Act. 25 years ago, there were thousands of gas stations that were leaking gasoline underground every year. Now there are very few, and all of those gas stations have protective measures in place to prevent it from happening again. 25 years ago, we had nearly twice as much nitrogen going into the Chesapeake Bay as we have right now. Similar reductions in phosphorus. Submerged aquatic vegetation has has significantly rebounded in the bay with a whole lot more nursery habitat as a result. Oysters are recovering to some degree after hitting historic lows like 1% of what they were when John Smith came over. They're recovering now. We used to have 1,200 tire piles that caught fire, and now we don't. And we do a lot of strategic planning now. We try to look to the future regularly because it's so easy for the urgent, the everyday phone calls and all of that sort of stuff to get in your way of the long-term planning that says this is where we need to be 10 years from now. And we're about to launch on another round of those planning processes just this spring. So we need to keep improving. Another thing that Jim Collins said that impressed upon me is as soon as organizations think they've achieved greatness, their deterioration has already started. So we don't want to fall into that trap, so we believe in continuous improvement, not only in who we are, but in the results that we accomplish. And so we're going to focus over the next few years on a number of things, but some of them I know are that we are going to look at new ways to communicate with the public. You've probably realized from my bio that I'm an old fart, and so I might not be as IT savvy as some of the rest of them, but we as an agency need to become more and more IT savvy. We need to learn to communicate more through electronic media, and we're going to do that. We're going to find better ways to communicate with the public. We are going to continue to work on climate issues and CO2 issues and coastal resiliency. We're going to continue to work on taking more steps to preserve our coastal aquifer for complete sustainability. We've got the bay cleanup that has made a lot of progress, and we've got to push it across the finish line and put plans together for that. And we've got to make plans for the workforce. Myself notwithstanding, probably about 30% of DEQ could walk out the door today. We got a plan for the future, and that's a thing that we're really going to focus on. I've told our folks just the other day that what we do matters, and so we need to do it well. We need to keep on living our values, and we need to keep making plans for the future. So I'm really, and I also want to say that video and a number of other videos that we did for this exercise, you can find on our website as well as some other documents. One of the documents sort of surveyed folks and asked them, what changes they'd seen in the last 25 years, and it actually blew me away. I guess 25 years is a long time. You ought to accomplish a lot. It looks like we did. It was pretty scary to see how much had been accomplished. I would invite you to get onto our website, deq.virginia.gov, and take a look at that and see where we've come from. And so what you're going to hear next is some of the more nitty-gritty details of what we're planning in the regulatory world. So I think at this point I hand it over to Melanie, or do I ask Amy to come back up? I just hand it over to Melanie. Thanks a bunch.
Thanks, Justin. The one on the right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for apparently rating our DEQ regulatory update a high enough rating from last year that we are back to talk to you again. One of the challenges with giving this program is that if you actually were here every year, year after year, it wouldn't necessarily sound like we start in the middle, because sometimes I feel like I'm just starting in the middle, but I really am building on the update from last year. My first slide, unfortunately, is kind of a great kickoff slide because it shows all of the VIPD's general permits that we have in use in water permitting. The reason they're part of this regulatory update is that every one of those general permits is its own regulatory action. They exist for 5 years because that's the limit of a VIPD's permit. So once Justin is able to get that up there, you'll see a snapshot of all of the general permits that are constantly in revision and update and development in the Water Permitting Division. And in fact, it is a large portion of the work that we do in the division. There are a couple permits that I thought I would mention because they have been recently reissued. The first is our general permit for the regulation of non-contact cooling water discharges, small discharges of 50,000 gallons per day or less. That permit came into effect March 2nd of this year. And it is not terrifically different from the last version of the permit, but we are requiring that the permittee develop an operations and maintenance manual for the equipment that they use to meet the effluent limitations that are included in this permit. I remember when this permit first came up, I was like, I'm not sure I understand exactly what it covers, but think of it as, you know, really large rooftop cooling systems, that kind of stuff, and the water that comes out off the operation of those. To catch up. And Justin, this is all going to be posted, available, all the presentations? Okay. So this was the one I talked about. This is our universe of all the general permits that seem to be constantly somewhere in the reissuance process. And it's just a snapshot of the permit effective date, expiration date, and a staff contact, just in case you have an interest in particular one of these. As I mentioned, recently we reissued the non-contact cooling water, and I think the biggest change to note in there, well, actually two. The first, which is if your discharge is tied into a municipal separate storm sewer system, you have to include a copy of notification of registration of your unit both to the MS4 at the same time as you give it to DEQ. And then, as I mentioned, that we now have a requirement for an O&M manual. Another one that we just reissued, this is tetchy. Here we go, sorry about that, is our general permit for discharges from petroleum contaminated sites, groundwater remediation, and hydrostatic testing. So this permit applies as if you are utilizing water for hydrostatic testing or you have an on-site groundwater remediation system and you need to discharge. What included in this permit also for the first time is the requirement to notify an MS4 operator if the discharge does go to an MS4. And also we have made it clear that any dewatering projects or discharge flows have to be managed to control volume and velocity, to minimize erosion at the outlets, and to minimize downstream channel and stream bank erosion. One that we are now just teeing up for reissuance, I am so sorry, is our industrial stormwater general permit. This has thousands and thousands of facilities covered under this permit. It is a permit that includes a number of different requirements and monitoring compounds depending on what SIC code you fall into. We just issued our notice of intended regulatory action for this one, which closed March 19th. We are using a technical advisory committee, so folks who are interested in helping us develop this regulation and sit on the TAC were to notify us by the end of the comment period. And that's something that we do for all of our regulations, and I just wanted to mention that if anywhere in the course of all of these slides and conversations there are regulations that are of particular interest to you or have a particular bearing on what you do or where you do it or how you do it, you should be checking the Virginia Regulatory Town Hall, because every time we kick off reg development, we do a notice of intended regulatory action, and we actually invite folks to offer to volunteer to help us in our regulatory development. For this particular reissuance, on the bottom, I've sort of summarized the issues that we know we need to take a look at this time. Electronic reporting requirements. We are looking down the barrel of EPA's electronic reporting rules, so we're going to have to figure that one out for this. Corrective actions under the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, requirements if your discharge happens to be in an area where there's an existing total maximum daily load. And we want to take another look at industry sector-specific monitoring requirements. I always mention the EPA 316B final rule, mostly because it is a rule that has been in litigation almost since the time it was adopted. It is a federal rule, but we have adopted it pretty much verbatim. Actually, I'm not sure we've adopted it into the state reg, so don't quote me on that. But as you can see, this rule actually became effective over almost 4 years ago. And even though it has been in litigation, the rule is still effective. So we are working through it. Thankfully, we don't have a whole lot of facilities that are required to comply with it. But the July 14th, 2018 date is the final date, after which we have to include permit conditions to comply to the rule, which happens to be in litigation at the federal level. In addition to that long list of general permits that I shared at the front, we also have 2 stormwater-related general permits. The first is the construction general permit, and the iteration that we're currently operating under, that permit expires June 30th of 2019. We generally anticipate 18 to 24 months for reg development, so we try and kick off a new technical advisory committee or a regulatory advisory committee 24 to 18 months before expiration. So we've actually started working with our TAC on the construction stormwater general permit. We've had about 3 meetings. If anybody here participated in the last version, I have to say that we seem to have worked a lot of the kinks out in the current version. So this process has been going really, really smoothly. And of course, this applies to any construction activity where an acre or more of land is disturbed. We anticipate taking a proposed regulation to the State Water Control Board sometime in the fall of this year. Then we'll go to public hearing and take a final to the board in the spring. The other stormwater general permit that we utilize is the MS4 general permit. It's the phase 2 small MS4 general permits. This permit actually expires on June 30th of this year. We have been through the reg development process. We had a number of public meetings with our TAC in 2016 and 17. We went through a public comment period, which actually just ended about a month ago on March 9th. We held 3 public hearings, Richmond, Roanoke, and Woodbridge. And we got, I think, in excess of 200 comments towards the very end of that public notice and comment period. The issue here, though, is that in order to meet our reissuance date of July 1st of this year, we would have to have been ready to go to the State Water Control Board with the proposed final reg next week. And we are not, due to the number of comments that we got at the end of the comment period. Plus, we were a little challenged with some of our board meetings and agendas. So I have to admit, we're running a little bit behind on this permit. The good news is, since it does apply to MS4s, that is not a universe that is actively growing and changing, unlike some of our other permittees. And we do have a provision for administrative continuance in this permit. So anybody who is covered under the existing permit will continue to have coverage even when this one expires. And Jamie Bauer asked me to remind any MS4 representatives in the room that we are still going to be asking registration statements be submitted by June 1st of this year. So happy to talk to you about that if you have any questions later. Wanted to make mention of biosolids, just a couple of points there. In October of 2017, the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission published a report on the land application of biosolids and industrial residuals. They'd been working on this report for about 2 years, and their primary conclusion was that Virginia's regulatory program is effective and that the risk from land application is low. However, they did recommend 2 further studies by the Virginia Department of Health One, they suggested that VDH conduct a pilot epidemiological study. One of the things that folks have often commented on is that there has never been a widespread epidemiological study on possible or potential, or if any, impacts from use of biosolids. That study was to be contingent upon some funding from the General Assembly. As you all may or may not know, the budget is still unresolved, so I can't report whether or not that money is in there. The other thing that the study asked of VDH to assess is whether our regulations should be modified to reduce the risk of infections for residents living near application sites when application is done during windy conditions. And the way JLARC described that was, whether you might be able to pick up a cold because of windy conditions during application. The other thing I wanted to mention on the biosolids front is we have issued a pilot distribution and marketing permit to DC Water for the Class A cake biosolids that is now being produced at the Blue Plains Wastewater Treatment Facility. The permit was issued last month, and if you're a student of biosolids, you might know that our permits are generally 10 years. What we did in this permit was we only issued it for a 2-year term because it is the first of its kind. When we adopted our biosolids regulations, nobody was actually utilizing or creating Class A cake biosolids. We thought that all of that exceptional quality biosolids was going to be pelletized and bagged and look a lot more like traditional fertilizer. But in this case, the product is actually being applied on agricultural fields in a way similar to Class B biosolids are. So we're not requiring individual permitting and public notice of those fields, but we really wanted to keep it on a short time frame because we just weren't sure how it was going to unfold in terms of it's a brand new product, and we just wanted to do a pilot. And Blue Plains DC Water was very willing to work with us on that. So that's that. One of the things that I did want to mention is we had a very busy legislative session this year in terms of bills that were related to water programs. And I'm going to run through a couple of the major ones, not because this is a lecture about what happened at the General Assembly, but because, in fact, a number of these will result in kicking off regulatory actions somewhere during calendar year 2018. So again, if I talk about something that you have a particular interest in, you can either let me know or keep an eye on the regulatory town hall and help us as we work through implementing these legislative initiatives. I seem to always talk about stormwater, and actually in a lot of ways, I'm really proud with how stable our stormwater program has become. We still have something, though, in statute that's called the donut hole, and that is just a colloquialism that we all use that relates to the idea that there are still post-construction quantity and quality requirements that apply to land disturbing activities. E&S under 10,000 square feet of land disturbance, or in a Chesapeake Bay local assistance, a CBLAD area under 2,500 square feet. So what happened was when we came up with the concept of allowing smaller, more rural localities to opt out of stormwater, because of the way some of the original statutes were written, in fact, those localities still have to figure out how to apply post-construction quality and quantity at those lower thresholds. So Delegate Keith Hodges, who is down on the Middle Peninsula, convened a group to try and figure out if we could come up with some options that would make it easier for those small rural tidewater localities to impose E&S and stormwater at those lower thresholds. So the first thing that we came up with was something called a tiered approach, which is very specific. It only applies to rural tidewater localities, but it allows them to use a tiered approach to analyzing post-construction water quantity based on the percentage of impervious cover in the watershed. This one is going to, we're going to have to figure out implementation. We've also been directed by the General Assembly to convene a RAP to clarify the use of minimum standard 19. Because one of the things that we learned as we had these conversations with Delegate Hodges was that there's a whole bunch of people throughout the Commonwealth who have very differing opinions on what MS-19 means, which is the traditional E&S requirement for controlling post-construction quantity. So we've got a little bit of work to do in stormwater. However, this bill is limited to only applying in rural tidewater localities. Additionally, in rural tidewater localities, there is a bill that allows those localities to accept stamped or signed plans for land disturbing activities less than 2,500 square feet, sort of on their face. So it means that they don't have to have the staff to review those plans as long as they have been stamped and or signed and submitted by a professional who is licensed to prepare such a plan. In this one, we have also at DEQ been directed to look at the possibility of expanding the use of an agreement in lieu of a plan, which is something that we currently utilize in stormwater for single-family detached residents. This one I threw in there. It's fairly specific, so I am not going to talk about that. Termination of construction general permit coverage. Under our construction general permit, we assess a permit maintenance fee as long as that permit is open and active and hasn't been terminated. And this bill just put a couple more requirements on our local VSMP partners in terms of getting back to DEQ on the question of whether or not a permit can be terminated. And that has been, they're asked to do that now within 60 days of receiving a notice. And then, once they get that notice, if action hasn't been taken, then coverage shall be deemed terminated 90 days after the notice. So it's just to make sure that there's good communication between our VSMP partners and DEQ. There were a couple MS4 related bills. Oh, and I wanted to say too, for any bills that are current, that have an asterisk in them in this presentation, they have been signed by the governor. There are a couple bills that are not marked, and that was because at the time I did this presentation, they had not yet been signed. So it's not quite the end of the story. This actually is a bill that has to do with authorizing MS4s to develop a high-risk runoff program. And one of the things that's interesting in this is that there's been a little tension between the MS4s and DEQ in terms of responsibility, MS4's responsibility to keep track of industrial dischargers that are permitted by DEQ that are entering the MS4 system. So this is an attempt to make that a little easier for the locality to administer and then also to communicate the information that we need at DEQ. We also have an interesting bill about non-commercial fundraising car washes. This one hasn't been signed. I'm not sure exactly how this is going to unfold when all is said and done, but in its latest form, this prohibits a locality from banning a non-commercial fundraising car wash if they use biodegradable, phosphate-free, or water-based cleaners, and it also prohibits us, the State Water Control Board, from issuing a permit that prohibits the discharge of non-commercial fundraising activities. Under the Virginia Water Protection Program, or our wetlands program, there is a piece of legislation that states that we, DEQ, shall not require a permit for wetland and open water impacts to stormwater management facilities that have been constructed on dry land. So, you know, as these programs mature, we start seeing the interconnection among all of these different things, and folks rightly felt that we shouldn't require a permit for them to engage in maintenance or retrofit of a stormwater management pond, which sort of made sense to me. There's also a bill regarding the opportunity to use an abbreviated public notice in a newspaper with a link to our website for minor industrial VIPTES notices, as long as that's consistent with federal law. And then there were a couple bills related to natural gas pipelines in Virginia. The first is a stop work construction bill. This was actually DEQ legislation, where we realized that our local partners had an ability to issue a stop work order for activity that was violating erosion and sediment control regulations, whereas DEQ didn't have that same authority. So this bill empowers DEQ to issue a stop work construction only for land disturbing activities related to natural gas pipeline companies and for pipelines where their size is greater than 36 inches. There has to be a substantial adverse impact to water quality, or an imminent and substantial adverse impact to water quality is likely to occur. This legislation actually had an emergency enactment clause, which means it became effective on March 10th of this year. And then finally, there is a bill that codifies the approach that we took in looking at the two large natural gas transmission pipelines currently in Virginia, and that involves the issuance of a Virginia Water Protection Permit along with an additional water quality certification for upland impacts. And again, this applies to pipelines which are greater than 36 inches and require a FERC certification. So, sorry, I always end up talking fast because there's a lot of things to update. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Yuta to do a water planning update. That one, and it's really touching.
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. Justin, can you find my presentation? Good afternoon, everybody. While that gets, oh, well, there it is already, very quick. I wanted to start by just briefly talking a little bit about one of our big initiatives for 2018, which is the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Implementation Plan process. David mentioned that we're getting underway with a lot of initiatives, working with the Secretary's office on public outreach, on planning efforts, and working with the stakeholder advisory group to try to roll a lot of these items out. I didn't put a lot of slides together for this because the importance of this topic is reflected in the fact that there are a lot of sessions here at Environment Virginia about that. So I would just encourage everyone, if you're interested at all in that topic, to attend one of those sessions. And also, we have information posted both on the DEQ website and also the Secretary of Natural Resources website on the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Implementation Plan efforts. So I would encourage you to check back there and check back frequently. We'll keep that updated to keep everyone informed about what's going on. It's always difficult, as Melanie said, to try to figure out exactly how to focus these presentations. I've done different things the past few years as well, but this year we were also very present in the General Assembly with several bills, so I thought I would focus on two big topic areas. One is groundwater management and the bills that were introduced about that, and the second topic is water quality standards. And both of those have ongoing activities in the department that we expect to take a lot of our time in 2018, so this seemed a good place to start. And I will put on my glasses. The last year I was still able to do it without it, but this year it's not going to work. All right, so the first bill, and all these groundwater bills have been signed by the governor, so they will become effective July 1, is House Bill 211 related to groundwater permit terms. This was an item that came out of the Groundwater Management Advisory Committee to extend the permit term of a groundwater withdrawal permit from 10 years to 15 years. It comes along with the direction to the board to increase the groundwater withdrawal permit fee from $6,000 to $9,000. You will note that we have two versions of the spelling of groundwater on this slide. This reflects an ongoing debate as to whether it's one word or two words, and we're still not quite decided on that. We are going to have to proceed with a final exempt regulation action on the permit fee regulation, so look for that to happen sometime this summer. The next bill I wanted to mention was House Bill 358 on groundwater technical evaluation for subdivisions. This is a bill that also came out of a lot of discussion in the advisory committee about withdrawers that aren't currently subject to permitting and how to capture this volume of groundwater that's getting withdrawn from the Potomac aquifer to be able to better manage that. So what this bill does is it requires developers of subdivisions with 30 or more lots that will be served by private wells to apply for a non-binding technical evaluation from DEQ. And this evaluation has to be completed prior to final subdivision plat approval. So the way that we envision this process to work is that we would get the information about those proposed wells, and that we would be able to evaluate that to see what the impact of these wells on the aquifer will be. And then we would make recommendations about which aquifer would be the most appropriate or suitable for that withdrawal for those wells to be installed in. So if a developer decides it's non-binding, so a developer can choose to not follow our recommendation. However, in that case, they must record a mitigation plan approved by DEQ with the subdivision plat before drilling any private wells. Again, this is something that we're going to be starting to look at how to implement here pretty soon. We are starting to work on an application form as well as mitigation plan template, and we'll be soliciting feedback from stakeholders so that we're ready to roll this out July 1st or very soon thereafter. Next, House Bill 1036. This is not requiring any action on the part of DEQ directly, but it was another outcome of the advisory committee. There was a lot of interest and a lot of discussion around trading and banking, which basically means, how can you, similar to nutrient trading, is there a way to make it work so that if a permittee has, a volume of water that they have a permit for, but they don't need it? Is there a way to trade that? Is there a way for somebody to, inject water into the aquifer for a banking program? How would all that work? There really isn't any framework for any of that right now. And it was very difficult and a very complex project with a lot of considerations that were brought to the table as part of those conversations with the advisory committee. So the House Bill 1036, which again has been signed by the governor, establishes a groundwater trading work group to further study this issue and to on how to develop an aquifer storage and recovery banking system, and what would the components of a groundwater trading program be. The bill requires, or the law requires, that the report, there should be a report with recommendations to the State Water Commission and the Director of DEQ no later than July 1, 2020. So that will be an effort over the next couple of years. The initial membership of this group is suggested to be the members that were part of the banking and trading work group under the GWAC. But there's opportunity for other folks to participate and provide feedback. And then I just wanted to mention a couple of other groundwater topics that have been keeping us busy and will continue to keep us busy over this coming year. The first is the topic of human consumption, and how do we prioritize that with our permitting and compliance and groundwater management programs. Again, this was a topic that was hotly debated in the Groundwater Advisory Committee. It was also a big subject in the JLARC report on groundwater management, on water resources management in Virginia. Again, it's a challenging topic, and we have been asked by the chair of the House Agricultural, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committee, Delegate Marshall, to review the relevant sections of the Code of Virginia and report back to the committee on how DEQ interprets and implements the language that talks about this. We anticipate some stakeholder outreach over the summer to again ask for people's opinions and thoughts on this topic. No easy path forward was identified, so this will be another challenging topic to work through. And then last but not least, on the groundwater side, we've been working very closely with numerous stakeholders on the Eastern Shore to make sure that that aquifer is managed responsibly and that groundwater resource is available for all of the people on the shore that need groundwater. We have been receiving permit applications from many of the agricultural users out there, and we are working through those to try to be able to issue permits that are protective of the aquifer as quickly as we can and as protectively as we can. So that was the hot news on groundwater, and I want to briefly talk a little bit about water quality standards, which also saw a bill introduced this year, which was certainly unexpected. I don't think there's been very many that relate to water quality standards, but this one got one, and it's about the Ammonia Criteria. This got signed by the governor on the 29th, so hot off the presses, also effective July 1. And it prohibits the board from adopting the new ammonia criteria unless the adoption includes a phased implementation program. And in case you don't know, but water quality standards provide sort of the basis for all of our water quality programs. They drive our permitting, they drive our water quality assessments that we do to see if the waters are, safe for recreation, for drinking, for, all kinds of designated uses that we evaluate. And EPA several years ago promulgated new ammonia criteria that are more protective of, in particular, mussel populations. And the way that this process usually works is that as part of our ongoing review of water quality standards to make sure that they're up to date and current, we adopt the EPA standards into our Virginia regulations. And the ammonia criteria are part of a current rulemaking that's underway, and so this bill is requiring us to include a phased implementation program in this adoption of the criteria. There were a couple of other items in this bill. It directs DEQ to identify other states that have adopted the new criteria and to identify procedures on how we're going to implement this phased implementation program. The other part that was of that part of that bill was that if we go forward with this new language as part of our current rulemaking, we don't have to start the rulemaking process over again. So we will make those changes to our proposal and then put the whole proposal back out for a 60-day comment period. And we believe that we can still make the timeline to bring this proposal to the State Water Control Board in December. And then I will, oops, this is a little touchy. I threw this one in just because it's related to ammonia. This is a bill that related to the Water Quality Improvement Fund and gives some authority to the DEQ director to allocate some of those funds for the water treatment plant upgrades that will be required to meet those new criteria. And this is something that we'll be working with our clean financing folks and our permitting folks on to address. This requires a report by November 1 of this year. So again, a lot of activities related to ammonia through the summer. And then I wanted to round up the water quality standards topic with just a couple of updates. So the ammonia criteria were part of a rulemaking that we started a couple of years ago that included bacteria, cadmium, and 94 human health criteria. Those three parts of that four-part rulemaking are still on track to be proposed to the State Water Control Board. We hope to take them to the board in June. We've had our public comment period for that. We received comments, so we plan to present a final for adoption to the board in June of those three groups. I put triennial review on here because, as you may remember, we just finished one. This is a requirement that we have from EPA to review our water quality standards every 3 years. Usually, a rulemaking process can take up to 3 years, so we're talking about a lengthy process to do those revisions. EPA has now decided that the minimum federal requirement is to have a public hearing on the water quality standards every 3 years. So even though we just finished this rulemaking this past winter, fall, we will be going out with a new public hearing for the next round of triennial review sometime this summer to meet that federal requirement. And last but not least, I just wanted to give an update on the James River chlorophyll criteria. That is a project that a lot of you have probably heard. It makes me appreciate the fact how much goes into developing these criteria, because certainly this one has been very complex. We have spent a lot of time and resources on the science behind the criteria. We've had a lot of support from very many different groups to try to help us figure out what are the best numbers to use for chlorophyll in the James River. We have spent a lot of time and resources modeling the James River to try to figure out what will be the impacts of the various reductions as part of the Chesapeake Bay TMDL and the reductions that are required there. We're still not quite there yet with respect to being able to propose a final number, but we are working with VIMS on getting those model runs and scenario runs done so that we can bring a solid proposal to the State Water Control Board. Again, the expectation is that we will be able to do that this calendar year. So that's where that stands. Again, working with the Regulatory Advisory Panel and many stakeholders to try to figure this one out, and appreciate everybody's patience and collaboration on that. And with that, I will stop and turn it over to my AIR colleague, Mike Dowd. And thank you very much.
Okay, I'm Mike Dowd, Director of the Air and Renewable Energy Division for DEQ, and I'm going to time myself. We do have limited time. If any of you were at any of the public hearings on our climate rule, we limited everyone to 3 minutes. So if you felt frustrated during that, well, now I'll be frustrated limiting myself to 15 minutes, because I could go on for hours here, but I won't do that. I'm glad to be here today, and let's see if this works. Uh-oh. All right. Okay, is there a, which one? Right side. I'm trying to go backwards too. How did it go? There it goes. Okay. Okay, well that chewed up a few of my minutes. Like you just said, it is difficult sometimes to try to hone down the topics, but the three I'll try to hit on today are criteria, pollutants, and ozone. Something we're all excited about in DEQ is our proposed carbon trading rule. And if I have a few extra seconds at the end, I'll give an update on the Volkswagen settlement. There's a lot of talk these days about cooperative federalism in the Trump administration. But frankly, cooperative federalism, the concept is nothing new. Frankly, it underpins the entire Clean Air Act. Under the Clean Air Act, as some of you may know, maybe a lot of you don't, it sort of sets up a bifurcated system. EPA is responsible for establishing health-based, what are called national ambient air quality standards that are designed to protect human health with an adequate margin of safety. It is the state's responsibility to implement those standards and make sure we achieve them. So what EPA has done is it has set national ambient air quality standards for 5 or 6 criteria pollutants, depending on how you want to count particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, lead, 2 forms of particulate matter, and there's one I'm missing here. I think, was it sulfur dioxide? Oh, lead. I think those are the big ones there. And what we do, it's our job to make sure we achieve those standards. So, try it again. Okay. Come on, Mike. You know, no matter how you try, there it is. No, okay, I'm pushing the wrong buttons. No. And now it just went off. Well, I can show you this great graph I have about how pollution has gone down over the years. And unfortunately, it'll sort of follow up on what Dave said. You can see here, these are total criteria pollutants from the year from 2005 to 2016. So, and here's another graph of the same thing. The numbers you're not going to get anyway. That's just a nice big, that would just be a nice big colorful display. But you get the drift. Pollution, the amount of criteria pollutants in the air is going down dramatically. And it has been over the past decade. Ta-da! And now,
just hit the space bar or the arrow.
The arrow, now I got it. Okay, so that's the nice big one there. And that's in another, just phrased a different way. It's a little bit more colorful. The other one goes up to 2016. The 2017 data we just got in has just been certified, in fact, on Friday. We haven't had enough time to put it on a graph yet, but my understanding from my folks is that it shows a continual downward trend in emissions. Now, I talked a second ago about national ambient air quality standards. That's a little bit different. Those are ambient concentrations, a little bit different from mass loadings. But I just wanted to show you in this chart, it's the same. When the pollution mass loadings go down, concentrations go down. So for sulfur dioxide, the standard up there is 75. See, all our monitors are way below that. For sulfur dioxide, fine particulate matter, the same thing. Each one of those colored lines going way down, those are all our monitors. The standard is 12, the 12 parts per million there, billion, and we're way below that as well. Here we go. Now, just a couple of minutes on ozone. See, ozone is the same thing. Ozone concentrations, high ozone days have been going down dramatically since 1997. In fact, 2017 was our best year ever for ozone. Lowest concentrations, even though the standard now is set at 70, Northern Virginia is the only area not meeting the ozone standard. In fact, it's the only area in the state not meeting any of the NACs. It is the only part of the state in non-attainment for any of our standards. EPA has delayed implementation of the 70 standard and may formally reconsider it. I don't think they're actually going to reconsider it. But as Dave said earlier, we're almost in compliance with the 2015 standard. You're going to say, 2017 and 2019 are going to be very important because compliance is determined on the 3-year average of the 4th highest reading. It's called the design value. So 2017 was good. 2018, we're hoping for a good year. 2019, you can never, a lot of it's going to depend on the weather, but we think all the pieces are in place. There are several programs that have been in place that have been reducing emissions over the years, that have in turn been reducing ozone concentrations. Power sector, power plants have been transitioning to less polluting generation. We do have more renewable energy online, but that's really been minuscule compared to the switch to natural gas. Industry fuel conversions are ongoing as well. Many industrial boilers have been switching from coal to natural gas over the past few years. Natural gas is just so cheap. We also have the Tier 3 motor vehicle and fuel standards that kicked in 2017, which lowered sulfur in gasoline, and what that did was make catalytic converters that much more effective, so they're removing a lot more NOx from the tailpipes than they used to in the newer cars. So really, the Clean Air Act has been one of the best kept secrets in the environmental world. It's been really a fantastic success story. Well, let me turn now quickly to our carbon rule that we're really excited about. Give you a little bit of background on it. In June 2016, Governor Terry McAuliffe issued Executive Order 57, directing the Secretary of Natural Resources to convene a work group to develop recommendations to reduce Virginia's carbon emissions. And the work group membership included Secretaries of Natural Resources, Trade, DEQ Director Dave Paler was on it, the DMME Director was on it as well as a representative from the Attorney General's office. The group held 6 meetings and 40 presentations and over 8,000 written comments, and that was honchoed by our Secretary of Natural Resources office. Well, the work group's report to the governor was issued on May 12th of last year, and the report's first recommendation was to establish via a regulatory process a trading-ready carbon emissions reduction program for fossil fuel-fired electric generating facilities to enable participation in a broader established multi-state carbon market. Now, quoting the report, it said there was tremendous public interest in this particular recommendation. The work group believes that it is important and necessary that Virginia work through a regional model like the established and successful RGGI. What's RGGI? In order to both achieve lower compliance costs and address the interstate nature of the electric grid. Well, for those who don't know, RGGI stands for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative Program. It's a carbon dioxide cap and trade program covering fossil fuel-fired electric generating units in 9 Northeast states: New York, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Delaware, and Maryland, and New Jersey is about set to join as well. Now, the covered sources, they have to purchase allowances in quarterly auctions that are run by RGGI through a consultant, and with the revenue being returned directly to the states. So that's what RGGI is. And also playing into the equation was on the same day the work group's report came out on May 12th, the Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring issued an advisory opinion that concluded that the State Air Pollution Control Board is legally authorized to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And the letter said the board has the authority to establish a statewide cap on GHG emissions for all new and existing fossil fuel electric generating plants as a means of abating and controlling such emissions. So, with that background, on May 16th, a few days later, Governor McAuliffe issued Executive Directive 11, directing the Department of Environmental Quality by no later than the end of that year to develop a proposed regulation under existing state law, and that's important, for the State Air Pollution Control Board's consideration to abate, control, limit carbon dioxide emissions from electric power facilities. And the proposed rule would have to include provisions to ensure that Virginia's regulation is what's called trading ready, to allow for the use of a market-based mechanism and the trading of carbon dioxide allowances through a multi-state trading program. That's quite a mouthful there. You notice it did not mention RGGI by name, but when you look around, the RGGI program was the only multi-state trading program in existence, really the only game in town. So the intent was for us at DEQ to develop a program, a rule that was linkable to RGGI. Now, we went through an extensive public process, while at the same time holding discussions with the RGGI states. We developed, at DEQ, we developed and submitted a draft proposed RGGI linkable carbon rule for fossil fuel generating facilities and presented it to the State Air Pollution Control Board at its December 2017 meeting. Now, our rule, and you know, I steal from stuff, and my folks do whenever we at all possibly can, because it saves us a lot of time. Our rule is heavily based on the August 2017 RGGI model rule, which they, just good timing, happened to come out with while we were developing ours as well. Now, our rule tries to track RGGI as much as possible. It includes a 3% annual declining CO2 budget beginning in 2020, which is when we'd join the program, which would decrease carbon dioxide emissions 30% by 2030. Our rule also contains what's called a CCR and an ECR. A CCR is called a Cost Containment Reserve. It's a key part of the RGGI program. It's a mechanism where if allowance prices get too high, that more allowances are released into the market to control the price, to make sure the price doesn't get out of control. By the same token, there's an emission containment reserve where if the price of allowances get too low and the program isn't achieving the amount of CO2 emission reductions that were forecast, then allowances would be withheld from the market to stabilize the price and assure continued emission reductions of CO2. One big difference between what RGGI does and what we'll be doing, I mentioned earlier, RGGI directly auctions, the RGGI states directly auction allowances and receive the revenue from the RGGI auctioneer. Here in Virginia, we're proposing to allocate allowances to regulated sources, covered sources, based on their energy output, and then require those sources to what's called consign those allowances to the RGGI auction for sale. Our program would also have a 5% set aside to the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy for programs that further reduce CO2 emissions, such as energy efficiency programs and things like that, but that have to be a clear tie-in to further CO2 emission reductions. Now, just a brief word on a consignment auction. It's, when you live it and breathe it, it sounds sort of simple to me, but I think it's a really complex concept in practice. We allocate conditional allowances to see what we call CO2 budget sources, and they are then consign them to the RGGI auction. The auctions are managed by RGGI Inc., and anyone can buy or sell allowances at the RGGI auction. Now, the cost of allowances, therefore, is determined at the RGGI auction by the clearing price. So we don't know what the value of the allowances is when they're allocated. That's determined in the price. Sources cannot use conditional allowances for compliance. They have to buy their compliance allowances at the RGGI auction. But what happens is that the revenue generated by the sale of their consigned allowances is returned to CO2 budget sources and entities by the RGGI auctioneer. And it's not as big a windfall at all to the covered sources as one may think. The revenue received by CO2 budget sources owned by regulated electric utilities should flow back to ratepayers pursuant to State Corporation Commission requirements. So we think that there is that the revenue does go to a public benefit. It will go to the benefit of the ratepayers, although it's a bit more circuitous than if we had auctioned the allowances directly. But we do believe that it should flow back to the ratepayers under our approach. Our process forward, the State Air Pollution Control Board indeed approved the proposed rule for public comment at its November meeting. A formal 90-day public comment period commenced on January 8th and closes on April 9th. So get your comments in. We've already gotten a whole bunch of them. As you can imagine, we conducted a series of 6 public hearings throughout the state, one in each regional office. We had 160 people testify, and our hearings were attended by over 350 people. There was great interest in it. Our key remaining issues, and these are very important ones, the biggest issue probably is what is going to be the size of our CO2 budget in 2020. We did some modeling that indicated it's between 33 and 34 million tons. That's what we proposed. There's other modeling out there that suggests it might be higher or lower, and we've gotten a range of public comments suggesting anything from 20 million tons at the low end to, hey, we shouldn't be joining RGGI at all on the high end. So we've got a lot of thinking to do on what our CO2 budget would be. Industrial units are exempt in our proposal. That's a subject the board specifically wanted to go to public comment on. Biomass, a real sleeper issue for us here at DEQ. We sort of tried to cut the baby in half. There's some biomass that's sort of complicated. Some biomass emissions are covered, some aren't. And we're hearing lots and lots of public comment on that from folks on all sides of the spectrum with that, and that's going to be a big call that we're going to have to make. And of course, we're in the process also of talking to RGGI. We want to make sure our program conforms to theirs as much as possible. We don't want to have the board approve a final rule that the RGGI states find unacceptable. So that won't happen, but we do have to make sure our language tweaks, dovetails with theirs, and that's going on. And finally, DEQ hopes to present a final rule to the State Air Pollution Control Board for consideration sometime later this year. Wow, pretty good. Sometime later this year, hopefully later in the summer. And we have a lot of information on our website. And that got me through, well, Okay, covers 33 sources. This is sort of where, where we stand with what's covered. And this will be on, you can see this, that'll be available for, when it's posted. I thought this is just an interesting slide because it shows in 2017, we went down to about 32 million tons. We've been sort of fluctuating between, at a low end in the high 20s, but it's gone up to as high as like 36 million tons, 38 million tons recently. We're getting more native load in Virginia. Dominion's building has built some very highly efficient natural gas-fired power plants. They're going to have another big one come online this year. But if you notice, the rate, the intensity has been going, even though we're generating more electricity, our carbon intensity rate has been going down. You see the blue and the black lines have crossed. Just because Virginia might be increasing, looks like, gee, we're generating more CO2 emissions, that's not necessarily a bad thing for the environment. It means less imported electricity. It means less electricity imported from coal generation out of state, things like that. So you really have to be careful. You have to look at it really regionally, impact regionally, and not just look at each state's carbon emissions. These are just the covered sources in the state. You see most of them are Dominions, but a good smattering of independent power producers as well. And that's it for carbon. And just quickly on Volkswagen, we have a request for proposals out for a $14 million infrastructure project for electric vehicles. Under the proposed consent decree, Virginia gets about $93 million. So we're going forward on the EV infrastructure portion of that. And stay tuned. We are working now to develop our priorities for spending the remainder of the consent decree funds, and we're working with the governor's folks on that to determine priorities within the confines of within the consent decree. So that's all I have to say. Sorry for running a couple of minutes over, Justin. Turn it over to my colleague, Justin Williams from the Lands Division. Thank you.
I'm just glad you didn't break this because I tried to go green and didn't print a copy, so this would have became, how much does Justin remember about his presentation? So, all right, home stretch, fifth one in, standing between your bathroom break and your coffee, so we'll go fast. So just starting out in the solid waste world, we were able to finalize some guidance related to our landfill gas regulatory requirements. This actually tied back a bit to some of the work in the General Assembly with some focus on some landfill gas issues that have arisen at facilities around the state. Really, we wanted to be able to put some more information out there on practices and management to be able to address those issues. And part of that came through a work group that was put together to look at that and be able to finalize that guidance coming this year. We also revised our solid waste planning regulations. This was a big part of our efforts to reach out to stakeholders, especially solid waste planning units, and talk about updates to the solid waste management plans and planning for their future. We wanted to provide some additional clarity regarding those requirements to the units, and we updated those regs as a part of that. We are going out this year on a notice of intended regulatory action to revise our regulated medical waste regulations. Those regulations haven't been revised in about 15 years, and by virtue of some challenges that have come along with some Class A infectious substances that we dealt with in terms of potential issues like with Ebola, as well as different changes throughout the technology in the industry, we're planning a regulatory update to those this year. Recycling, the General Assembly has passed, but the governor has not yet signed, but I'm assuming will likely. Senate Bill 218. This does a couple of things. One of the things it does within the recycling provisions of the Virginia Waste Management Act is to actually define beneficial use, beneficiation facility, and recycling center. It actually incorporates the term beneficial use into some of our other provisions in that. section specifically related to what the board and DEQ does. One of the big aspects of this and one of the key drivers was it actually identifies recycling centers and beneficiation facilities as manufacturers for the purposes of grants. And that becomes important, for example, when interacting with the Economic Development Partnership and being able to have grant opportunities from that. But not to be forgotten, it does require DEQ to study recycling and to look specifically at the market and possible incentives that could be identified, particularly over the next 10 years, and to actually look at the impact of mixed waste facilities. These are materials recovery facilities that take combined solid waste and then sort them out, look at the impact of those on the recycling, and then actually produce a report by November 1st of 2019. So obviously, as a part of this effort, we'll be reaching out to a lot of stakeholders as well as looking at what other states have done and being able to provide that information back. On the hazardous waste side of the house, one of the big items that have come out actually came out from EPA. That was an update to the hazardous waste regulations across the board, specifically focusing on hazardous waste generators under their improvement rule. There were over 60 changes made to those generator regulations and really broke down into addressing 4 different parts. One was to reorg the actual regulations and make them easier to understand. If you've ever dived into the 40 CFR 260 to 265 realm, it was a little bit of a hodgepodge, so this actually reorganizes those generator provisions. It allows for some increased flexibility, particularly when you deal with what's known as episodic large quantity generators, or those generators who fluctuate between status, which could actually change the requirements. So it finally addressed those. It helped to clarify the existing requirements for generators, particularly to make it clear in terms of the requirements before tripping over into something like requiring a permit. To make that clear, it actually included some substantive provisions to help increase and improve protection, and then actually just made some technical corrections. That becomes effective in Virginia actually this week. It was incorporated by reference into our Virginia hazardous waste management regulations, and we've actually already have a webinar and have trainings, 6 scheduled throughout the Commonwealth to be able to provide training and education to folks on those requirements. Another topic that you've probably heard a little or a lot about, depending on your interest, is coal combustion residuals, or CCR. This is my CCR, not Mike's CCR, because we apparently can't get different acronyms in this business, but on my side of the house, CCR is coal combustion residuals, or coal ashes, it's frequently known. As you're probably aware, last year, Senate Bill 1198 placed a moratorium on closure permits for solid waste for the closure of coal combustion residual surface impoundments in the Chesapeake Bay until May 1st of this year. This year, the General Assembly addressed this issue again through Senate Bill 807, and that's actually done a couple of things. That still has not been signed, but it has been passed by the General Assembly. It extends that moratorium to July 1st of next year on CCR units closing in place in the Chesapeake Bay. The distinction there is this actually extends to landfills as well as surface impoundments, whereas the previous bill did not. And it also extends that moratorium for permitting related to units that are going to close in place versus permitting for units that are being excavated, removed, or not being closed in place. It does require the owner-operator of these units to put out a request for proposals by July 15th, 2018 to look at recycling and beneficial use of CCR, and then to submit a business plan December 15th of this year as a result of those proposals. Concurrently, EPA has been busy on a lot of rulemaking actions, and one of those is actually related to CCR as well. March 15th, they published proposed regulations to their national standards on coal combustion residuals. There had been one previous rulemaking in light of a settlement since the final regs were put out. This is a more substantial one that kind of gets at 2 different parts of their federal rule. One is related, again, to settlements from a federal lawsuit. Another is to actually address or look at provisions resulting in, specifically because of the WIN Act, which recognized a state, or in the absence of a state, a federal permitting program. Under this rulemaking, one of the issues that EPA had to clarify in the lawsuit was looking at non-groundwater releases and what would be required in terms of corrective action, whether it's the full measures under the regs or something else, and they have put out that proposal that will delineate those measures based on the time it takes to take those measures. It adds borons to the list of constituents, which is significant in terms of the constituent list that actually triggers corrective action for these units. It determines the requirement for the proper height of woody and grassy vegetation for slope protection, because EPA had to vacate a provision that was specific to 6 inches for proper height of woody and grass vegetation. And it also addresses an issue related. There's very specific provisions for the continued allowance of a unit to stay open when it would otherwise have to close. In very specific circumstances, this actually extends that to allowing the management of non-CCR waste into those units under those particular provisions as well. The big, another big part of this, and a lot of the interest is actually related to the other provisions that allow for state directors, or actually potentially EPA in the rulemakings, considering if EPA is running the permitting program, or even potentially in a more self-implementing fashion, to do a couple of things. One is to establish risk-based groundwater standards in lieu of just MCLs or backgrounds, to allow circumstances under which groundwater corrective action does not have to be taken, or that groundwater monitoring requirements can be suspended. Being able to look at the length of time to demonstrate that a corrective action remedy is complete, the length of time for post-closure care, and to certify that the regulatory criteria have been met in lieu of exclusive reliance on the qualified professional engineer. That's related back to the original self-implementing portions of the EPA rule. On the petroleum side of the house, the feds previously, actually in 2015, did a significant revision to the underground storage tank regulations. Those became effective in Virginia through our incorporation January 1st. Some of those substantive requirements became immediately required. Some are actually being delayed until 2021, depending on the status or the upgrade of the tank. The Petroleum Program, we're continuing to do 2 particular studies through Virginia Tech, who's going back and looking at data where we've done cleanups at petroleum sites, focused on vapor intrusion and the extent and necessity of cleanups where vapor intrusion could be an issue. We're also doing one related to a look-back characterization in terms of looking back at those cleanups now a decade later. Is the risk still mitigated, and has the cleanup been properly and fully completed? Another big portion of what we're doing in this program is looking at what's known as our usual and customary rates, and this relates to whenever an individual goes out and uses a contractor to do their own cleanup under the program, being able to access the fund, what those rates are for different types of activities. We held 2 stakeholder meetings last year, and we will be putting forward those revisions this year. Last but not least, because it's the program everybody loves, it's Brownfield's VRP. We are doing some work there, particularly with the Mount Rogers Planning District Commission and a partnership. We actually submitted to be able to get funds under the EPA Brownfields Assessment Grant to be able to work with them to have pass-through money or incentivize opportunities for cleanups of brownfields down in the Southwest Virginia region. And next week, we are hosting the Central Appalachian Brownfields Initiative Network Conference. That'll be in Pulaski, Virginia. This brings together individuals both federally and state from Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky to focus in on the Appalachian region and incentivizing brownfields there. And one of the other significant things we've done this year in the remediation programs is, if you're familiar with our hazardous waste or RCRA corrective action site universe, EPA put out a 2020 list in terms of getting those sites to actually having a remedy. Virginia has about a handful left, and we're actually taking those actions on. So Virginia will be handling all RCRA corrective action states in Region 3. This will allow us to finish and ensure that all Virginia sites meet the 2020 goal, as well as take over the operation and oversight once the remedy's been implemented. And that's it. And we'll open it up now, I guess, to Amy and questions. Thank you all.
Okay. Hello? Hello. Okay. Hello? Oh, very good. I want you to know that when people come to work for DEQ, they all talk normally, and then they grow up and talk like that. Questions? I'm going to run around, but does someone have questions for these nice people? Or do you all need to stand up and stretch? There's got to be a question.
I have a question.
Please stand.
I'm the only one who gets to stretch. My name is Nan Gray. I'm a licensed professional soil scientist, and my question about the CO2 is, in all this consideration for CO2 sequestration, we know that undisturbed soils that have not had land-disturbing activities, sequester the CO2. So in the meantime, when we're talking about Mountain Valley Pipeline and Atlantic Coast Pipeline ripping up soils, that's going to release a lot of CO2. I want to know whether or not you've considered what you're contributing to the atmosphere if these pipelines are actually built. Got it?
Got it. And the short answer is no. And the reason before that is that water quality certification processes don't take those things into consideration. So I'm not aware that we have any regulatory basis to look at those things. FERC may have such a basis, I can't tell you, but in terms of the regulatory action that we've taken, those things are outside of our scope of authority.
Our gentleman was talking about CO2 emissions.
Correct. That's CO2 emissions from power plants, electric generating facilities, and those are the only CO2 emissions that are regulated, that are proposed to be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And I believe, if I understand your question correctly, that those are not sources that would be regulated under the Clean Air Act.
Well, they're certainly not, it's not a point source or a source facility unit that would be regulated under our state air pollution control law. At the moment, our regulation, our proposed regulation is focusing on power plants. I think we have undertaken quite a rulemaking. Is it a plenary rulemaking? Is it going to consider all carbon sources, emissions throughout the state? No, it doesn't do that. It doesn't pretend to do that. It's looking at power plant emissions. At some other point, the state may be looking at those more tertiary emissions as well, but not right now.
Do we have other questions?
Not in the air division. That's something that would be totally outside the purview of my group, and I believe DEQ as well.
Are there further questions? Anybody up top? No, huh? Anyone? Last call. Well, thank you very much. You've been a very, very gracious and patient audience. We appreciate it.